I finally decided I'd come out of retirement and have another go. So it's remarkable. I mean, we very much hoped it would come in the autumn. It's been rushed upon us. I hummed and hawed as to what to do.
In the terms of the number of MPs you might win?
No, you're right. I mean, we have a completely outdated electoral system. It's not fit for purpose, but it is what it is.
Imagine a political outsider, once dismissed as a fringe figure, now making seasoned journalists squirm in their seats. That's exactly what happened when Nigel Farage stepped into the BBC studio for what was supposed to be a routine interview. What followed was a masterclass in political communication that's got everyone talking. From immigration numbers to economic policies, Farage didn't just answer questions. He turned the tables on his interviewer. Stay tuned to see the moment that could change the course of British politics. Nigel Farage dropped a statistical bombshell that sent shockwaves through the BBC studio. "A migrant a minute enters the UK," he declared, his words cutting through the air like a knife. The impact was immediate. BBC host Naga Munchetty's eyes widened, her composure momentarily shaken by the weight of Farage's claim.
Back in 2015, when I led UKIP into a general election, we got 4 million votes and 1 seat, albeit with Labour at the moment some way ahead. So we've had a phenomenal start. I mean, I've been back as leader for, this is day 11, and if you look at the Times newspaper today...
But Farage was just getting started. With the calm demeanor of a seasoned politician, he began to unpack his statement, citing government data that seemed to back up his assertion. Over the last 2 years, 2.5 million people have arrived in the UK, he stated, his voice steady and confident. That's 1 in 30 people on the streets who've come in that time frame. Munchetty, visibly taken aback, attempted to challenge Farage's figures. But the former UKIP leader stood his ground, his resolve unshaken. As the atmosphere in the studio grew increasingly charged, Farage pressed on, linking immigration to a host of broader issues plaguing British society. 52% of the migrants who arrived in the UK during this period were dependents, not workers, Farage explained, his tone matter-of-fact. He painted a picture of a nation struggling under the weight of its own generosity, with public services stretched to breaking point and housing becoming increasingly scarce. The conversation took a turn towards the economic impact of immigration. Farage argued that the influx of unskilled labor had driven down productivity and contributed to rising living costs. The fact that young kids can't get houses, the fact that rents are up over 20%, he laid these problems squarely at the feet of unchecked immigration. As Munchetty struggled to regain control of the interview, Farage delivered his coup de grace. He highlighted the stark contrast between the Conservative Party's promises to reduce net migration to tens of thousands per year and the current estimates of around 750,000. "We're living through a population explosion we can't cope with," he declared, his words hanging heavy in the air. The shift in power dynamics was palpable. Munchetty's frustration seemed to grow with each passing moment, while Farage remained composed, his arguments flowing with a practiced ease. It was a masterclass in political communication, leaving viewers to wonder, had they just witnessed a turning point in British politics? As the interview shifted gears, Nigel Farage turned the tables on his host, transforming from interviewee to interrogator. With a steely gaze, he launched into a scathing critique of the BBC, accusing the broadcaster of acting as a political actor throughout his career. The studio atmosphere crackled with tension as Farage recounted specific instances of what he saw as unfair treatment. The start of this campaign, the BBC had behaved like a political actor, Farage declared, his voice laced with frustration. He painted a picture of a media landscape where alternative voices were systematically silenced and ridiculed. Munchetty, visibly taken aback, struggled to maintain control of the conversation as Farage pressed on, presenting evidence of what he claimed was the BBC's partisan reporting. The discussion broadened, touching on the media's influence on public opinion and democratic processes. Farage argued that the BBC's coverage had been consistently biased against his party, Reform UK, and its message. He pointed to instances where he'd been cut off mid-sentence during live broadcasts, a tactic he saw as indicative of the BBC's bias. But Farage wasn't just complaining about personal slights. He raised broader concerns about the BBC's coverage of Brexit and immigration, suggesting that the broadcaster had failed to represent the views of those who support stricter immigration controls. The implication was clear. In Farage's view, the BBC was not just reporting the news, but actively shaping it. As the interview reached its climax, Farage dropped a bombshell that left the studio in stunned silence. If elected, he declared, his voice steady and resolute, "I promise to campaign for the abolition of the BBC." The gravity of his statement hung in the air, a challenge not just to the broadcaster, but to the entire British media establishment. Farage's critique aligned with a growing sentiment among some politicians and public figures who have called for BBC reform or abolition. He argued that the broadcaster's funding model, which requires viewers to pay a license fee, stifles alternative political voices and acts as a real enemy to genuine political reform. As the interview drew to a close, it was clear that Farage had done more than just defend his policies. He had launched a direct challenge to one of Britain's most established institutions, positioning himself as a disruptive force, ready to shake up not just politics, but the very way Britons receive their news. The question lingering in viewers' minds was clear. Was this the beginning of the end for the BBC as we know it, or would the venerable broadcaster weather yet another political storm? As the dust settles on this explosive interview, Nigel Farage emerges not just as a political figure, but as a formidable force, challenging the very foundations of British media and politics. His performance has sparked a wave of newfound respect among viewers, impressed by his straightforward communication style and ability to handle tough questions. The contrast between Farage's calm demeanor and the host's growing frustration was stark, showcasing a shift in power dynamics that could reshape the political landscape. Experts are now predicting that Farage's growing influence could lead to a significant realignment in British politics. Traditional parties may find themselves under increasing pressure to adapt or risk losing their voter base to smaller, more disruptive forces. This shift could pave the way for new coalitions and alliances, fundamentally altering the political playing field. But the question remains, is Farage the disruptive voice British politics needs, or a dangerous populist? His ability to articulate complex issues clearly and stand firm in his convictions has won him admirers. Yet, his confrontational approach and controversial views on immigration and the BBC have also raised concerns. As viewers mull over the interview's implications, one thing is clear. Nigel Farage has just written a new chapter in British political discourse, and the story is far from over.